Welcome back to the Grow Like a Mother podcast. Today's Woo Woo Wednesday, of course, and I have a new guest today. Her name is Cyndi. Cyndi is also known as the Energetic Ethnographer. She is a clairvoyant, a psychic, and an energy worker. She's based in California, and Cyndi blends academic expertise, she's a PhD, with her intuitive insights and likes to explore the dynamics between energy and spirituality. She's an expert at this. She's founded the Intuitive Tarot Academy, where she teaches tarot with an emphasis on intuition rather than memorization, which is something I really love, which is kind of what made me reach out to her because I love the way that she teaches tarot. And she's also really really into supporting kids and teens and families by focusing on the energy dynamics and creating those personalized solutions in your home that can foster understanding and connection. So I want to dive in to that today as well. Cyndi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you for the introduction. I love hearing how people introduce me, which sounds a little ego, but I have a hard time explaining who I am and what I do. And so when it's like distilled by somebody else, I love it. And I'm excited to be here for Woo Wednesday. I can't
Yeah.
wait.
Yeah. I mean, I'll start by just saying tarot for me is something I've dabbled in over the last little while. I go in like fits and spurts, or however you say it, where I'll be consistently pulling cards and then I'll fall off the bandwagon for a bit and then I'll come back to it. But through a lot of recent energy work and work with energy healers, as it turns out, I'm very witchy and very intuitive. And I'm like, okay, I need to like practice and figure this out. So I'm trying. And I've even bought little decks, like kid decks. I've got four
Mm-hmm.
kids and some of like the older ones are interested. So that's kind of my expertise. But I would love to start the show by you giving like blank slate, what the heck is tarot? Like, where do we start with this conversation?
So they're pretty pictures on cardstock. Like that is my starting point with everyone because we imbue them with so much power, right? Like when I was a kid, Ouija boards, tarot decks, that was not allowed in my house. My mom was very adamant that it not be allowed.
Yeah.
And as an adult, I'm like, I bring them into her house all the time. And she's like, that's not allowed. I'm like, Mom, they're cardstock. They're really pretty pictures. Think of it like artwork. And that's usually my entrance point with people, regardless of where they are on their journey, is like, view these as a way to access information that you're not already seeing. And for some people, they interpret that as like a Rorschach test or something of that nature. And for other people, they're seeing what I'm really saying, which is when I look at a spread or I'm using tarot or I'm pulling my daily card, I'm looking at what jumps out first and foremost in that card for me. And that's my approach to teaching, is like teaching people how to trust what their own story of the cards are, and also reminding people each deck is different. I love that you got your kids' decks. I have so many decks. I have a few kids that I work with that are starting to get into it. I have a 17-year-old in particular that I work with, and he loves it. Like that was our entrance point. And actually was my entrance point into spirituality as well. I really thought that they could tell the future. I saw them as like fortune telling cards and then realized that's not how they work. But for me, they're a really great way to connect to your intuition and a really great way to connect to the unseen forces around us, whether we want to call that spirit or energy or combination or the universe or God. I find it as a really great tool to access things, especially for those of us that are a little bit more academic or a little bit more analytical and a lot more sciencey, but we know we have that access or information available to us. I find it's a really good entrance point. And the way in which I was taught was, okay, cool, there's like hundreds, if not thousands of books. You can absolutely memorize the highlights of each card and you can do the deep dive. And that felt so heavy to me. And that was how I started as an academic and a scholar, was like, let's go this route. And I was like, this isn't working. And when I realized it was a helpful framework to like think about certain aspects of the card, but ultimately I can get the cards to actually just talk to me in my mind's eye. And that's always been much more supportive. And in working with clients or families, I find it's a really helpful like way to tell a story sometimes as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic description. And for the listeners who will realize just how green I am, I did not realize it was tarot instead of tarot.
Okay, so here it is whatever you want it to be. I was taught by a 60 or 70-year-old woman who I think I was told she was Swedish. I thought she was German, but somebody corrected me recently and was like, she's Swedish. I don't know if it was her accent, but that is how my entire meditation center said it. And that's how I've continued to say it. And I get a little flack sometimes on TikTok of people being like, that's not how it's pronounced. And like, that's cool, like tomato, tomato. However you want to pronounce it, like by all means, go for it.
Okay, cool. Good. Thank you for that. Now I
Yeah.
don't feel quite as new at this. I love how you brought it, you described my best friend to a T when you were saying the academic mind, but curious about some of the unseen stuff. But like this is a nice entrance point to try to reconcile those two sides of your brain, right?
Yes. And the way that I see that is like, depending upon the deck. No, I am not the biggest fan of the traditional Rider-Waite deck. I think for some people, it's a great entrance deck. For a lot of people, I think it becomes it's a very no, programmed. There we go. It's a very
Yes.
programmed deck, meaning there's universal meanings that people over decades and hundreds of years have decided this is what it means. And I find those decks more challenging for people that are more academic or scholarly because then it puts them in that box of a cup is always this, a wand is always this, the Hierophant always means that. And if I take a deck and I pull out a few cards and I pull out ones that don't have words on them and I hand them to someone that's more academic and I ask them to tell me a story, they're actually really good at storytelling and they can pull out the pieces and tell a whole story. And I'm like listening and being a little, psychoanalysis and like hearing what they're saying. But I feel like it takes the spotlight off of I am doing something unusual or working with something that is not seen and gives the permission to go into imagination and creativity, which is how we access our intuition and opens up that space. And then once that becomes comfortable, some people go on to do other types of modalities. Some people just stick with tarot. But if your bestie is like hardcore academic scholar, like sees this a specific way, I'd be curious if you got an oracle deck or a deck that didn't have the words and you handed her some cards, what she would come up with, because I find that to be really interesting.
Okay, so here's another question. The difference between tarot and oracle cards.
So tarot decks are based off of the Rider-Waite, which is 78 cards, and it has the four minor arcana, cups, pentacles, swords, and wands. And then it has the major arcana, which goes from the Fool all the way through to the World with 22 cards. Oracle decks are much different in the sense that they don't have to have 78 cards. A lot of them are very inspirational. The way in which things are drawn and the energy that's imbued in them is much more reflective of the artist and the author. And with a traditional tarot deck, you get the artist and the author in these different versions. Like my current favorite one is erotic fantasy. My all-time favorite one is Universal Goddess deck. And in both those decks, you're getting someone else's interpretation of the High Priestess. And so it's following a specific framework and like kind of staying within that framework to some degree and imbuing the energy in a very similar fashion. Whereas Oracle decks are kind of, in my opinion, a little bit free for all. And I think they're equally valuable. And I think people that are more scared or more sensitive to lower vibrational energies or quote unquote negative things do better with Oracle decks. Whereas Tarot, sometimes those cards get real harsh real quick.
Right. Okay. So take me through if I'm listening to this for the first time and I'm like, okay, they're not all bad, they're not scary, like the devil's not going to come get me. Maybe I'll try this. And they want to just poke about, they grab themselves a deck. How do they start? Like, what does it look like to do a reading or to pull a card?
Totally. That's such a great question. So I actually want to take it back one step,
Mhm.
and that is how do you pick a deck? And so one, I actually have there's the quiz on Intuitive Tarot Academy of like how to pick a deck, and it's based off how you interpret information. And it makes some suggestions to a couple different decks. And that has proven to be really helpful for new practitioners and for people that didn't know certain types of decks existed or didn't think about how do I interpret visual information? And I mention this because some decks are super, super detailed and you get a lot of information in a single card. And some decks are much more simplistic. Some are more floral or spatial, and others are like fantasy or they're calling in goddess energy as an example. So my recommendation to people when they go to get a deck is if you can get your hands on the deck, awesome. Like if you can like flip through the pictures, awesome. If you can't because you're wanting to sponsor a local artist or you're doing like a not a GoFundMe, a Kickstarter, if you can look at the imagery, do you resonate with that energy? And so my first step for people is always, what's the deck that's calling to you? And my first deck was a Mayan deck, and it had a lot to do with past life information. It's a deck that I have a more challenging time using after 15 years, but I will always keep because it was my first deck. So once you have your deck, there's a lot of things you can do. If you're a ritualized person, you can cleanse your deck, etc. If it's a secondhand deck, I do encourage people to cleanse, but like to each their own. And then from there, it's really user informed in my world because it's very much what's your intuition telling you. So if you're pulling a daily card, what I do is I shuffle the deck a few times and then I just split the deck where I feel called. And then whatever card's at the bottom is my card for the day. And I find for myself with daily pulls, that's really supportive. If I am doing a, let's say, 3-card spread for myself, I might fan the cards out and kind of put my hand over them and find what card I want. I know some people that like to count down a certain number of cards. I know some people that shuffle till the cards all kind of fly out of the shuffling process or whatever they're doing there. And however you choose to get the cards out, whether you take the top card or the middle card or the bottom card, from there, my recommendation to people is always, what's the first thing that jumps out on that? Especially if you didn't have a specific question, like what's the first imagery that you're noticing, or what's the first thing that like really is calling to you? And then from there, like what else do you notice and how does that impact your day? So for example, if I pulled the Tower card today, I would be very aware that there would be a lot of things that are feeling pretty unshaky for me. And like perhaps we have to break down a few more ideologies before we take these steps forward. On the reverse, if I got the Lovers card, I might be like, okay, it's a very heart-centric day for me. I can really show up authentically. People can have my emotion. And that would just be like a daily pull. I also encourage people to log their cards and like log the notes that they're taking, because what you're essentially doing by pulling daily specifically, you're creating your own lexicon, and it's specific to that deck, and ultimately it will probably be translatable to other decks. But in my erotic fantasy deck, for example, for whatever reason, the Chariot card looks like the Lovers card. I kid you not. Like every time I pull it, I'm like, I got the Lovers, and I go to like read what the description is, and I'm like, this is not the right card. And in my head, it has to do with the imagery. And so I still apply my personal lexicon of how I see the Lovers card to the Chariot in that deck because that's what makes sense to my brain. And I'm only able to do that because I've tracked kind of my major key takeaways of cards over 15 years, more or less. If I'm doing like a spread, that's a little bit different, and that requires either some self-study and like what works for you, or taking a course or something of that nature. But you can do it on your own. Like you can say like, what do I need to know about tomorrow? I'm meeting with this person. Where are they going to be? You can do super complex spreads as well. And I always tell people like, read the booklet, see the author took the time to write the booklet, read the booklet, see what it says. But I use that as like the last thing I do as opposed to the first, so that I'm not biased by what they're already saying. And then after you've pulled your card, whatever you want to do, put it back on the deck, leave it out on your desk for the day, shuffle it, have a closing ritual. If you're doing a spread, I always encourage people to do some sort of separation afterwards, so that that reading or that experience stays in its own bubble and you're not carrying it with you throughout the day, especially if it's a heavier one and you have like a very enthusiastic day, or God forbid it's super enthusiastic and you have to go do something that's really hard. Like you want to kind of keep that a little separate.
Okay, that's awesome. I feel like some people who might be like, whoo, head is spinning right now. Like, come back, pause, replay, take notes. This is a lot, but it's not really a lot, right? Like, we just
Yeah.
broke it down to the base level and gave you all of the nitty gritty. And one thing that I did want to touch on was, can you describe for us the difference between the major arcana and then the 4 minors, which are basically like the suits of a deck of cards, right?
Yep. Yep. And it's theorized, but not proven, that our current playing deck is informed by Tarot.
Right.
But I've read it both ways, that like Tarot was informed by the playing deck. So I don't know which one is real. or true. And I don't think it matters. I just think it's a fun thing because I can read with playing cards too. Like it's just a little different. So the major arcana starts with the Fool as 0, and then you have it, the Fool meets the Magician all the way through to the last card, which is the World. The major arcana cards are typically big things happening in someone's life. They're archetypal. I like to encourage new practitioners, and honestly, practitioners of any level, to tell the Fool's journey to enlightenment, because you can take that Fool card, the card of the Fool, and put the major arcana in numerical order, and you can explain what the Fool is getting from each archetype that the Fool meets. And essentially you're telling your own story because you are the Fool. And there's different ways you can play with that, but I find that helps people get comfortable with the different archetypal energies and understand their current bias with them, because there's going to be at least one that you don't like. And I don't know anybody that does this work that doesn't go through phases where they don't like one. And it might change. I hated the Tower for years. And now I'm like, I love the Tower. I finally learned how to embrace it. Still hate the Hierophant, still hate the Emperor. And those major arcana cards are essentially indications of big experiences, bigger things happening, larger energies that you're working within. For some of us, we might see that card as like an unseen influence or an unseen support we have access to. I see that more often with some of the themed decks, like the Universal Goddess deck, because each card has a goddess. When I get, the Lovers, it's Aphrodite, and it's like, okay, cool, I'm working with her right now. So
Okay.
there's a lot you can do in the major arcana. The minor arcana runs from ace to 10, and then it has page, knight, queen, and king. Page, knight, queen, and king are called your court cards. Ace through 10 are just your standard cards. And the minor arcana is typically, just like major arcana is typically, everyday things. It's kind of like your ins and outs of every day, what's going on, how are you managing everyday energy. And you can get real nitty-gritty in numerology, and you can look at the court cards, and I'm actually just about to start a series on TikTok of like looking at the court cards and really start to understand what they mean in a spread or what they might mean to you. With the minor arcana, the suits each kind of represent an element. They each represent or have like their standard like takeaways, like cups slash chalices is oftentimes emotion. It represents water. And that also, I think, helps people understand, especially in those daily pools, how to interpret some of the cards. And that makes up the whole deck.
Okay. Incredible. I want to know whether or not it makes a difference if a card comes upright or upside down.
I don't read reversals. I am unique. I do not read reversals. I have died on this hill with people. The reason I don't read reversals is traditionally they're perceived as negative. And I am apparently an optimistic reader, so I've been told. And so to me, reading them upside down just gives an automatic something's wrong here. And in my experience, and this is specific to me, and when I teach, I tell people you can read reversals. This is the traditional way. Here's why I don't. I've always been able to get the same information with it being upright versus it being reversed. And some people, they love reading reversals, and I'm not going to get mad at you if you're like, I love reading reversals. I'm just going to explain my thinking and why it doesn't work for me, and then give people permission to do what they want.
And I think that's the beautiful thing about this is that it's such a unique experience. Everyone's going to create their own way to interact with their decks and read the cards, and it's their own symbolism and their own lexicon, as you said. So there's not really a right or wrong way. It's just understanding like what are the different components? How do we typically use them and making sure it feels right for you? Because as long as you're getting the messages that you're wanting,
Mm-hmm.
that's the point, right? Like the point of pulling a card or doing a spread is to access a part of your mind or source universe, whatever, that you don't have access to on the daily, right? Like
Yes,
it's sort of a
exactly.
across the veil entry point. Like, let me dip my toe into the unseen and get some insights, get some information from my own self and from all the
Yeah.
source to be.
And for me, it's very much from your own self first. My ideology, I start with my higher self, and that's what my first communication point is. I do have guides that connect with me through my cards and a few other interesting things that happen on occasion. But for the most part, it is that connection. And in terms of the mind, it's a connection to the subconscious and unconscious parts of the mind, because
Right.
that will come forward in the cards pretty quickly.
Yeah, people I think would be very surprised at the speed with which their intuition shows up when they start.
Yes.
Yeah.
My favorite thing to do in my 30s was go to the bar with the deck and just put it out, just have it sit next to me. And the number of people that are like, what is that? Or like start asking questions. And my favorite was a veteran from the military who was not in a good space. And he saw them and he's like, I want a reading. And I was like, cool. And he's like, can I buy you a drink? And I was like, sure. And he felt so validated because there was this person that was seeing pain in his face and was like, it's not yours, and like really validated where he was. But he was surprised that he got so much out of it because he was like, I've never done anything like this before and I can't believe this. And then he started reading the cards himself and he's like, I think it was like the emperor or one of the kings. And he's like, this was my commanding officer. And I was like, awesome. Like, you're getting this figured out yourself. And I think it does surprise people. We're not taught how to do that in K-12. Like, we are told not to access our imagination, basically, especially with the rise of testing in school. So to me, the second you help people connect to their imagination, the quicker they get to their intuition.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. That makes so much sense because it's really all just unseen. That's how we interpret all of the energy, right? Is it's our imagination, it's our intention. We're basically making it up, but we're how do you describe that?
I dare you to make it up. I dare you. When I was teaching or assisting at an intuitive training center where I trained, we on occasion would get students that would come in and are like, but how do I know I'm not just making it up? And we would have a running joke. I dare you to make something up. I dare you to make something up from a genuine space and not from a, okay, I've got a preconceived thing that Jill doesn't like the color purple or something like that,
Right.
and see what happens, because most of the time it's you're not going to be able to actually make it up. It's going to make sense. Now, reading yourself, I think, is the hardest part because you're not neutral to your own experience. And that's where I don't do a lot of readings for myself. I ask others to, or if I do read for myself, I ask for additional interpretation because it's really easy to ignore what you don't want to see.
Uh-huh.
But it's hard to make it up. It's really hard to make it up.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Would you pull a card for us today on the
I
pod?
would I would love to pull a card today.
Okay,
Now,
awesome.
do you want me to pull it for you specifically or for the collective?
No, let's pull it for the collective. For anyone listening, whenever you're listening, this is
Whenever you're listening, it's a relevant card to you. I'm going to be pulling from the Mystical Moments of Tarot, and it is a very Tarot of Mystical Moments. I was like, I didn't say that correctly. Tarot of Mystical Moments. It's a unique deck. It's a highly female deck. It has 5 extra cards. So here is where we get a little confusing. So it has an extra set of kings that are female versions of the kings, and then it has an extra emperor card, and it has a female version of the emperor card. And only in one spread in the 2 years I've had this deck have I had both emperors show up in a spread, and it was for someone's tarot for the new year, which is the special offering I do of like looking at your year ahead with tarot cards. And it was one of those moments that I was like taken aback, and I was like, okay, I need to like sit with this for a moment because I've never had this happen before. So just a little history on the deck that we're going to use. But
that's very cool.
yeah, I'm just going to pull whatever card kind of jumps out at me. Let's see. My least favorite thing about decks are the ones that have like the gold or silver foil on the edges of the cards. Lots of people love that. And I'm very much like, no, not at all. So we got the strength card. The other thing I love about this deck is depending upon the cards you pull, it's very Alice in Wonderland and very Wizard of Oz. And it's
Yeah,
like so great.
yeah.
So when you are listening to this, today's card for you is going to be strength. And the first thing I'm going to say is, what are you not pulling from that you could be? Where are you being hyper independent and could maybe borrow from someone else? Because a lot of times we get in our own way by that hyper independence. And then the other thing I would suggest is, where are you offering strength, not just to yourself, but to the world around you? And then in this deck specifically, so the strength card traditionally has the woman and the lion. In this deck specifically, I always see the woman is very much like comforting the lion. And so in this deck specifically, I usually see it also as like, Are you able to comfort something that's ferocious and allow something vulnerable to come through that ferocity that exists within you? And so that would be like my top line summary of the card for everyone.
That's so cool. That's a beautiful card too.
Thank you. It's a really beautiful deck. They also created an Oracle deck that I have as well, which is also really pretty. So one of my favorite decks, one that I use regularly with clients.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this has been so enlightening. I'm wondering if there's anything like, okay, so what I want to do is ask you, how do people work with you? Like, I love that new year sort of year ahead offering. Like, what else do you do that would be exciting for us to dip into and work with you?
So I do tarot readings for people, obviously, and I teach within the Intuitive Tarot Academy. Simultaneously, I have a second business, which is actually was my first business called Into the Known, and that's where I do all my clairvoyant readings. That's where I work with families and I work with kids and teens. And essentially, what I do is I'm looking at you as a spirit in a session and seeing what the energetic field around you looks like and what you're combating and how do we get you to your next point. And I have clients that come in with a range of questions, and it's great. And occasionally I run workshops through both Intuitive Tarot Academy and Into the Known. Intuitive Tarot Academy is much more structured. If you're ready to learn to read tarot, that's definitely the place for you. If you're wanting to understand energy and the basics of it, Into the Known is a little bit easier. And I actually have just created a new quiz, which is about looking at what kind of wanderer you are in your spiritual journey. Are you the free spirit that's just kind of roaming around? Are you the seeker? You're trying to find specific answers. Are you a catalyst? You're creating change for the world around you, or are you an unconscious healer? And in which case you're like healing. Unconscious healer also is like a bit of a people pleaser, gonna be honest. And so I have that available as well. But yeah, I read tarot, I do clairvoyant readings, I work with families in terms of helping them bring their family system into balance as it makes sense for them. I work with kids sometimes on emotional regulation. Some kids are incredibly psychic, and I'm the person that's teaching them how to manage that and still be a normal human. So kind of full range.
That's amazing. I feel like I want to have you back on the show to talk about like that clairvoyant energy, like family healing type of stuff. If you want to come back,
Yeah,
I'd be
I would
super
love
interested.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That'd be great because so I have a 7-year-old son and he's autistic, but he's also super like
Can I say
intuitive.
one thing? Can I say one thing? Because
Yeah.
you will be a good person to say this to. I People that are on the autism spectrum usually are missing filters that don't allow them to know what's real and what's not. And so they tend to be quicker to teach on how to re-engage those filters so that they have less chatter to deal with. And they tend to be incredibly clairvoyant. And I had this validated by a classmate that was autistic. And she's like, oh, yeah, no, I have less filters than you. I was like, okay, I'm not crazy. So,
No,
yeah,
that makes total sense. That's incredible.
yeah.
Ah, this was such a cool conversation. Thank you so much for coming on
Of
today.
course. Thank you for having me. This was
Yeah.
so great. It's so nice to talk about tarot and like how it's applicable to everybody.
Everybody. Yeah. And your
Yeah.
newsletter is fantastic. So everyone
Thank
go
you.
to Cyndi's website. We'll put it in the notes and make sure that you sign up for the newsletter. She's got so many really great tips and ideas and thought-provoking questions and just a lot of stuff in that weekly newsletter. And before we say goodbye, I always like to see, is there anything that wants to come through in terms of like something that hasn't been said or something you just want to share with the audience?
If you've been trying to figure out how to connect with spirit, this is your sign to use tarot.
Hmm.
And if that doesn't feel right, it's your time to get a pendulum because they tend to like offer different insights. But energetically, when I look at your audience, that looks like there's a lot of people that are ready and they're not sure which step. So pendulum or tarot.
Okay, quick. Pendulum, how does that work? Real quick.
You can use anything you want. You can get a pendulum map. You can make your own. You just have to basically set it yourself. What is yes, what is no, and then what is maybe and what is ask again later. And so pendulums are great for yes, no questions. And that's about it. Tarot is not great for yes, no questions.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So get both and
Yeah.
take the quiz on Cyndi's website to figure out what kind of deck. I'm going to go
Yep.
do that right now.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay, great. This is great.
Awesome.
Thank
Thank
you
you so
so
much
much.
for having me, Jill.
It's my pleasure. And everyone who's listening, let us know that you heard about Cyndi here. Send us a note, reach out to her. And if you're curious to start, let this be your sign. Okay. All right. And until next week, keep on growing like a mother.